In the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhood stood the Wellington estate, a monument to wealth, power, and the American dream. Today, it had become a shrine to the dead. Black luxury cars lined the marble driveway like a procession of dark beetles. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, threatening rain that seemed to mirror the supposed grief within. Inside the grand ballroom, transformed into an extravagant funeral venue, crystal chandeliers cast somber light over hundreds of mourners dressed in designer black. At the center sat an ornate mahogany casket adorned with white roses, each bloom worth more than most people earned in a week. This was no ordinary funeral. This was theater. Performance art for the ultra-wealthy. Richard Wellington. Tech mogul. Philanthropist. Billionaire. At 73, he'd built an empire that spanned continents, revolutionized industries, and touched millions of lives. His name was synonymous with innovation, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. And now, he was gone. A massive heart attack, the doctor said. Quick. Unexpected. Final. In the front row sat his family, draped in expensive grief. Veronica Wellington, his widow, was a striking woman in her late 40s with the kind of beauty that came from excellent genes and even better plastic surgeons. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, each movement carefully calculated for the cameras and curious onlookers. Beside her sat Marcus, their son, mid-30s, stern-faced, wearing an Italian suit that cost more than a used car. His jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes scanning the crowd with the cold assessment of a predator. Elena, their daughter, sat on Veronica's other side. Early 30s, elegant but distant, she seemed more interested in her phone than the ceremony honoring her deceased father. Every few seconds, her manicured fingers would swipe across the screen, her lips occasionally twitching with what might have been irritation or boredom. A distinguished pastor stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the cavernous space as he spoke of Richard's charitable works, his business acumen, his dedication to family. The words floated through the air like expensive perfume, pleasant, impressive, but ultimately hollow. Those who knew Richard well understood that behind the public persona of generosity lurked a man who'd crushed competitors without mercy and built his fortune on the backs of people he'd outmaneuvered. Scattered throughout the crowd were the true power players. James Thornton, Richard's business partner for 20 years, sat near the back. Silver-haired and calculating, with eyes that missed nothing, he whispered to his assistant with barely concealed urgency. There was something about his body language, tense, coiled, like a spring ready to snap, that suggested this funeral meant more to him than simple mourning. The guests themselves were a who's who of America's elite. CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and socialites, all paying their respects to a man whose influence had touched their lives in one way or another. Yet beneath the surface of propriety, undercurrents of tension rippled through the room. Whispered conversations. Sidelong glances. The subtle positioning of rivals and allies in an unspoken game of chess that continued even in death. Outside the massive iron gates of the Wellington estate, the world looked very different. Press photographers had been relegated to the street, their telephoto lenses straining to capture images of arriving dignitaries. Curious neighbors and regular citizens stood behind barriers, craning their necks for glimpses of the spectacle. Security guards in black suits and earpieces maintained a perimeter, their expressions professionally blank. Among the crowd, separate and unnoticed, stood a figure who didn't belong to either group. Thomas Reed, though most people just called him Tommy, was in his late 60s, with a face weathered by decades of hard living. His coat was tattered, held together with safety pins and hope. His shoes had holes worn through the soles. His beard was unkempt, his hair gray and wild. To the casual observer, he was just another homeless man drawn to the spectacle of wealth on display. But Tommy's eyes told a different story. They were clear, focused, burning with an intensity that spoke of purpose rather than madness. Clutched against his chest, protected from the beginning drizzle of rain, was a worn photograph. He held it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, it was. As the rain began to fall more steadily, Tommy approached the gate. Two security guards immediately stepped into his path, their hands moving instinctively to their belts where pepper spray and radios waited. The first guard held up a hand, his voice firm but not unkind. Tommy tried to explain that he needed to speak to the Wellington family, that it was urgent, that they'd made a terrible mistake. But the guards had heard it all before, delusional people claiming to be long-lost relatives, con artists looking for an angle, mentally ill individuals drawn to the spectacle. They saw what they expected to see, another homeless man, probably mentally disturbed, definitely not worth their time. The second guard placed a firm hand on Tommy's shoulder, preparing to escort him away. Tommy's desperation grew. His voice rose as he tried to make them understand. Before they buried Richard Wellington, before it was too late, the family needed to know the truth. They needed to know about Catherine. But his words fell on deaf ears. The guards physically moved him away from the gate, back into the crowd of onlookers who gave him a wide berth. Some looked at him with pity. Others with disgust. Most simply looked away, uncomfortable with visible poverty intruding on their morbid curiosity. Tommy shouted back toward the estate, his voice breaking with emotion. He gave his name, Thomas Reed, and said he knew the truth about Catherine Wellington. But inside those gates, surrounded by marble and mahogany and money, nobody heard him. Or if they did, they didn't care. Nobody noticed the way one woman in the crowd suddenly went very still at the name Catherine. Nobody saw her pull out her phone and begin typing furiously. In a world divided between the seen and the unseen, Tommy Reed had just become a problem he didn't even know he'd created. Back inside the Wellington estate, the funeral reception had begun. Waiters in white gloves circulated through the crowd with trays of champagne and caviar. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers. The casket had been closed now, sealed and ready for burial in the private cemetery on the estate grounds. The conversations had shifted from solemn remembrances to more practical matters. Stock portfolios. Business transitions. Real estate opportunities. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, death was both tragedy and opportunity, and the smart players were already positioning themselves for whatever came next. Veronica stood near a window overlooking the manicured gardens, engaged in conversation with Diana Hastings, her sister-in-law. Diana was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and elegant, wearing her grief like armor. There had never been love lost between these two women, and today's forced proximity only heightened the tension. Diana made a pointed comment about how exhausting the day must be for Veronica. The words were sympathetic, but the subtext was clear. She was watching, evaluating, suspecting. Veronica responded with a cold smile, noting that she was surprised to see Diana there at all, given that Richard and his sister Catherine had never had much affection for Diana's side of the family. The mention of Catherine's name created a brief, charged silence. Diana's expression hardened as she asked how long it had been since Catherine's accident. Veronica's response was clipped, controlled. 6 years. It had been 6 years since Richard's sister had died in that terrible car crash. Some wounds, she said with practiced sadness, never truly healed. But Diana wasn't finished. She brought up the fact that Catherine's estate remained tied up in Richard's trust, even after all this time. There was something pointed in her tone, something that suggested she found this arrangement suspicious. Funny, she said, how that had worked out. The implication hung in the air, funny for whom? Before Veronica could respond, and the flash of anger in her eyes suggested her response would have been cutting, Elena interrupted, pulling her mother aside with urgent whispers. There was a disturbance at the service entrance. Security had reported a man causing problems, claiming he knew Richard, saying he had information about the family. Marcus joined them, his irritation evident as he declared it was probably just another fortune hunter looking for a payout. He instructed Elena to have security call the police if the man didn't leave immediately. But Veronica asked the question that would change everything: what was the man's name? Elena shrugged, as if the detail was meaningless. Reed. Thomas Reed. She added dismissively that he was homeless, probably mentally ill, definitely not worth their time. Something shifted in Veronica's face. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hand trembled, causing champagne to spill onto her expensive black dress. Marcus noticed immediately, asking if she knew this man. Veronica recovered quickly, too quickly, insisting she'd never heard of him and ordering that he be removed from the property at once. But the damage was done. Those who knew Veronica well recognized the signs of fear poorly concealed. Whatever Thomas Reed represented, it was something that terrified the grieving widow more than death itself. The burial was scheduled for late afternoon in the Wellington family cemetery, a private plot on the estate grounds surrounded by ancient oak trees and marble statues. By the time the guests assembled, the rain had intensified, turning the manicured grass soft and treacherous. Black umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers as the crowd gathered around the open grave. The casket, gleaming despite the gray day, was positioned above the hole that would become Richard Wellington's final resting place. The pastor stood at the head of the grave, prayer book in hand, preparing to deliver the final words that would commit a billionaire to the earth just like any other mortal. The ceremony was somber, traditional, expensive. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The family stood closest to the grave, Veronica between her children, all three maintaining expressions of appropriate grief. James Thornton stood nearby, watching everything with those calculating eyes. Diana Hastings had positioned herself across from Veronica, as if even in death, the family needed to maintain their opposing camps. The pastor's voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm. Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust. Ancient words for an eternal journey. The casket began its slow mechanical descent into the ground, operated by unseen machinery beneath elegant brass railings. And then chaos erupted. A commotion at the back of the gathering made heads turn. Voices raised in alarm. Security guards running. And then, breaking through the crowd like a force of nature, came Thomas Reed. He was soaking wet from the rain, his clothes plastered to his thin frame. His eyes were wild but focused, burning with desperate urgency. His voice, roughened by years of street living, cut through the reverent silence like a knife. Stop. They had to stop the burial. Right now. Immediately. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound like wind through trees. Marcus moved to intercept the intruder, his face purple with rage. He shouted for someone to grab the lunatic, to remove him, to restore order to this desecration of his father's funeral. Security guards converged from multiple directions, but Tommy was driven by a purpose that made him surprisingly quick and agile. He dodged grasping hands and stumbled toward the grave itself, his voice growing louder and more desperate. Richard Wellington deserved to be buried with the truth, he shouted. Everyone needed to know what had really happened. Everyone needed to hear what the family had hidden. Veronica's voice, shaking with fury and something else, fear, perhaps, or guilt, demanded that someone remove this man immediately. How dare he intrude on their private grief? How dare he desecrate this sacred moment? But even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed her. She knew. Somehow, impossibly, this homeless man knew. Security guards finally seized Tommy's arms, but he fought against them with surprising strength. His eyes locked on Veronica, and when he spoke next, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. He said he'd served with Richard Wellington in Vietnam, back before the money and the empire. He knew Richard before the world knew him. They'd been brothers in arms, united by blood and battle and bonds that transcended social class. Diana Hastings stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos with authority. She told security to let the man speak. Veronica immediately protested, calling the idea ridiculous, but Diana overruled her. Catherine had been Diana's sister-in-law, she said, and if this man knew something about Catherine's death, then he had a right to be heard. Tommy's response dropped like a bomb into the gathered crowd. Not her death, he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery. That was the point. Catherine Wellington wasn't dead. The world seemed to stop. The rain continued to fall, but everything else froze. Hundreds of eyes fixed on the homeless man who had just spoken the impossible. Even the mechanical lowering of the casket paused, as if death itself waited to hear what came next. Marcus recovered first, his laugh cruel and dismissive. The man was clearly insane. They needed to have him arrested before he caused further disruption. But Tommy was undeterred. 6 years ago, he explained, Catherine Wellington had been declared dead after a car accident. But there had been no body. Just a burned-out vehicle and convenient witnesses who'd seen what they were paid to see. Elena told security they'd heard enough, that this was obviously the rambling of a disturbed mind. But Tommy pulled out his precious photograph, holding it up despite the rain that threatened to damage it. He shouted that he'd seen Catherine with his own eyes. 3 months ago, in a psychiatric facility upstate. She was alive. She was being held against her will. She'd been locked away and forgotten. Even from a distance, even in the rain, the resemblance in the photograph was undeniable. The woman looked older, haunted, diminished, but unmistakably similar to the Catherine Wellington whose portrait hung in the mansion's main hall. Veronica's voice cracked as she insisted this was impossible. Catherine had died. They'd held a funeral. They'd mourned. They'd moved on. But Tommy pressed forward with his revelations. They'd held a funeral without a body. They'd declared her dead so they could claim her inheritance. And Richard had discovered the truth. James Thornton stepped forward at that moment, his voice deadly calm despite the chaos surrounding them. He asked Tommy to repeat what he'd said about Richard's will. There was something dangerous in his tone, something that suggested Tommy had just revealed a piece of information that changed everything. Tommy explained that 2 weeks before his death, Richard Wellington had discovered that his sister was still alive. He'd been planning to expose the truth. He'd been preparing to rewrite his entire will and unravel the lies that had buried Catherine alive in an institution instead of a grave. Thunder cracked overhead, as if the heavens themselves reacted to the revelation. The casket remained suspended halfway into the ground, forgotten in the growing chaos. Marcus protested that his father had died of a heart attack, that doctors had confirmed natural causes, that there was no mystery to investigate. But Tommy's next words froze everyone in place. He asked, with quiet intensity, whether they were certain about that. Whether Richard's death had truly been natural. Or whether he'd been murdered to keep his secrets buried alongside his sister's stolen identity. Pandemonium erupted. Mourners gasped and whispered to one another. Some pulled out phones to record the spectacle. Others pushed toward the exits, wanting nothing to do with whatever scandal was unfolding. Veronica swayed on her feet, caught by Elena before she could fall. Diana stared at Tommy with an expression mixing hope and horror. James Thornton was already on his phone, barking orders in a low, urgent voice. Marcus shouted for security to take Tommy away immediately. The guards resumed their grip, beginning to drag the homeless man backward, away from the grave and the family he'd just accused of unspeakable crimes. But Tommy used his last moments to shout one final piece of information. The psychiatric facility was called Riverside Meadows, he yelled. Patient number 472B. If Catherine Wellington was truly dead, then why was someone paying $20,000 every month to keep her locked in that place? Why was money flowing from Wellington family accounts to keep a dead woman imprisoned? All eyes turned to Veronica. Her face was a landscape of conflicting emotions, fear, rage, desperation, and beneath it all, the unmistakable shadow of guilt. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Tommy was dragged out of sight, still shouting, still trying to make them listen. But his words had already done their damage. Diana Hastings was on her phone, demanding information about Riverside Meadows. James Thornton and Marcus had moved into an intense whispered conversation, their body language suggesting disagreement and accusation. The pastor stood frozen, prayer book still open to the burial service that had been so catastrophically interrupted. Some guests were fleeing toward their cars, unwilling to be associated with whatever scandal was unfolding. Others crowded closer, scenting blood in the water, eager to witness the fall of a powerful family. The press, kept at a distance but not deaf to the shouting, were straining to understand what had happened, cameras clicking frantically. The casket remained suspended over the open grave, Richard Wellington's final resting place denied by the chaos his secrets had created. The rain poured harder, as if heaven itself wept for truths too long buried, for lies too carefully maintained, for a sister erased and a brother silenced. Lightning flashed across the darkened sky, illuminating Veronica Wellington's face in harsh white light. In that moment, stripped of shadow and pretense, she looked like a woman watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. Marcus grabbed his mother's arm, his voice urgent and demanding. What did that homeless man know? What secrets was he revealing? But Veronica's response, when it came, was barely audible above the storm. Everything, she whispered. He knew everything. And there was no putting this truth back in its grave. The camera would pull back if this were a film, revealing the full scope of the disaster. A funeral descended into chaos, a family's secrets exposed, a billion-dollar legacy crumbling under the weight of one man's testimony. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be heard. And sometimes it takes someone with nothing to lose, someone invisible to the powerful, to expose what those with everything have tried to hide. The question hanging over the Wellington estate as the storm intensified was simple but devastating: who was telling the truth? What price would this family pay for their lies? And most importantly, was Catherine Wellington truly alive, waiting somewhere for a rescue that was 6 years too late? What happens next will shock you to your core. Did Veronica really murder her husband? Is Catherine truly alive? And what will happen when the full truth is exposed? Don't miss part 2 of this incredible story. Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button so you'll be notified the moment we upload the shocking conclusion. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The truth is more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in part 2.